Saturday, June the 1st, 1968.
Our English prayer today is on page 299, an English prayer which is based on the 21st Psalm and speaks of the ideal qualities which in a democracy one looks for in elected leaders. A very sore subject this presidential election year. Now, I would like to make a religious, not a political comment on what happened in Oregon this week. I must admit I am partial to Mr. McCarthy, but I think even people who are not partial to Mr. McCarthy could not fail to have been impressed by how far a man who is not corrupted by prospect of gain nor intimidated by threats of harm in their guardianship of the people, in the words of the prayer we shall shortly read, a man who put his career and his own future on the line in doing something as a public figure which he felt had to be done. We have grown accustomed to public figures only doing what the people want them to do. I don't know whether any of you saw a very disturbing program on the CBS television this week, showing what happens when people try to sell a political candidate. The way it was done was that you go and have polls, and you find out what the people want, and then you tell them what they want. You echo, in other words, the mass feeling on a particular area. The concept of trying to give people what they ought to want, or trying to elevate them to a higher level, does not enter into the plans of Madison Avenue. And there was this whole program showing how a candidate was deliberately selected with the eye to his image, and that his slogans and the words and the themes and the agenda which he promoted were not selected by him, but by the same people who sell detergents. Fortunately, he lost. There's a moral somewhere that you can fool some of the people all the time, etc. Now, some rabbis are taking the McCarthy business a little too far, and I noticed that Howard Singer, who I believe used to be a rabbi here some years ago, at least for a brief period of time, in his bulletin this week, announced that he's been elected as a delegate for the convention which elects the president. I thought rabbis couldn't do this sort of thing, but apparently a rabbi can, and some members of his congregation feel very badly about it. And he was defending himself in his bulletin article, saying, well, this is the way I feel, and if a rabbi feels strongly about a president, why shouldn't he go ahead and do this? You can vote your way, and you can do it if you want. I thought it was a bit of a far-fetched argument. I think maybe a rabbi really going out wholeheartedly for politics, unless in extreme circumstances, we're going to have trouble. Now, the Reconstructionist magazine did go out against Goldwater last year, and there was a special editorial printed which said that this is the first time ever that a stand has been taken politically, because it felt this was not a political decision but a moral decision. And in the same spirit, I feel that we have to take cognizance in the synagogue of what happened in Oregon this week, because I feel that this is an example of what can happen when a man does show a level of morality, ethics in his public life, qualities which Madison Avenue have tended to make us feel are not important anymore as selling oneself. And no matter how far McCarthy goes, he has demonstrated what integrity can do. I think he has raised the moral fiber of this country. He did say after he received this remarkable success that he was having a special limited edition of campaign buttons printed, and the slogan which would be on them would be, "For McCarthy before New Hampshire." Limited edition, strictly limited edition. And there's a great moral in that. He has a wry sense of humor, which is interesting. It is interesting because when a man has to stick his neck out, there are very few people around to help. But when the sticking out of the neck begins to produce some kind of success, there are all sorts of nachschleppers who are ready to jump onto the bandwagon and claim that they were there at the very beginning. And that's their idea from the very beginning. And they thought this way from the very beginning. And that's exactly what we wanted it to be from the beginning. But that button will be a strictly limited edition. And this is not merely a political point that I make, but in all areas of morality in life, and the moral fiber of our country could be raised. And people look around for the other man to take the first step, and that's not the way to go about it. We have to make our own first steps. And in far too many moral issues in this country, those who support the first step wear a button which comes out in a strictly limited edition. And in the spirit of our reflection on what one man of integrity has done in sacrificing a great deal in order to raise the tone of political life in this country, let us now read together on page 299 in the prayer book. God, the strength of the nation, which speaks to us of the quality of the men we should be thinking of appointing as our elected leaders. Not men who reflect our own personal subjective wishes, but men who would elevate us to a concept of leadership which is more than merely what we want personally, but what is good for the nation as a whole, as well as for the individual constituents of the nation. We commenced reading today in our synagogue the book of Numbers, or Bamidbar, the fourth of the 5 books which constitute the Torah, the history and the constitution of the Jewish people as conceived by our ancestors. The Torah, or the term Torah, means many things. Sometimes it means the whole of the Bible. Sometimes it means traditional texts beyond the Bible, inclusively. But in this sense, we are referring to the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of the law. The word Pentateuch means, in Greek, 5 books. And in Jewish tradition, we refer to these books by the opening words of these 5 books. The opening verse of the first book is Bereshit bara Elohim, and we call the first book of the Torah, in the sense of Pentateuch, the book of Bereshit. The Greek translators of the Bible, in the Septuagint, spoke of the content of the book rather than the opening Hebrew words, and their term for the first book of the Bible was Genesis. And similarly in Exodus, the opening verse in Hebrew is Ve'ile Shemot. And the second book of the Bible we Jews call the book of Shemot. But again, the Greek translators, thinking of the theme rather than of the opening Hebrew words, spoke of the content of the book as the book which describes the going out of Egypt, and therefore they call the book Exodus. And Bamidbar is the opening word in the Hebrew. Numbers, again, in the Greek, refers to the content. It is a book of statistics to a very large extent, as we shall see. The book of Bereshit sets the background to the Torah, or Pentateuch, by giving a description of the creation of the world. And indeed, the rabbis of old were puzzled as to why there was a need for having a book of Bereshit at all in the Bible. One rabbi asked why there was a need for any part of the Torah before the beginning of the actual legislation. Was not the Torah simply a book of law? To which the answer was, no, it was not a book of law. God had to tell the whole world, the letters patent of the Jewish people. God had to tell the whole world why the Jews owned the Holy Land. And indeed, the Torah is the writ, the legal claim that the Jewish people has to Eretz Yisrael. The book of Genesis and the early part of Exodus is the Jewish declaration of independence. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Now that was written in a naturalistic universe of discourse. The Torah, which was written in a supernaturalistic universe of discourse, also has its declaration of independence, but it is couched in pre-modern. Not exactly supernaturalistic, because the word does not truly apply to the Bible, but certainly in perhaps better mythical terms. And if you moderns think it is arrogant to start the historical prolegomena to a constitution of a people with a consideration of cosmogony, which is what the book of Bereshit is about, we must remember that in pre-modern times the existence of our people was conceived of as precisely having such a cosmic significance. Reish Lakish asked why, of all the days of the creation, the sixth day had an extra letter attached to it. It was Yom Sheni, Yom Shalishi, Yom Revi'i, second, third, fourth day, and so on. But when it came to the sixth day, it was Yom Hashishi. The rabbi saw in even an extra punctuation mark or letter profound teachings, because this was not just an ordinary book, it was the book of God. And Reish Lakish continued in a lesson which is relevant for the festival of which commemorates the season of the giving of the law, which we celebrate tomorrow. God said to the Ma'aseh Bereshit, or to the principles on which the earth rested, if the Jewish people accept the Torah, the world will continue to exist. But if Israel refuses to accept the Torah, the world will return to chaos. A remarkable spiritual arrogance, only possible in the pre-modern world. Namely, that whether or not our people accepted the Torah from God determined the continued existence of the physical cosmos. Now this, in a mythical age, was the declaration of independence of our people, which is then followed by laws, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. Having described the origin of the universe, the origin of man, and the origin of the Jewish people, the Torah proceeds in the book of Shemot, or Exodus, to an account of Israel's captivity in Egypt, the escape from Egypt, the sojourn at Sinai, culminating in the receiving of the Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments. And in the third book of the Bible, Vayikra, or Leviticus, legal details are added to an already comprehensive law given at various stages of this development, with special stress in this third book of the Bible on ritual and sacrifice. The book which we commenced reading this morning, the book of Numbers, or Bamidbar, deals with the march from Sinai, the wanderings in the wilderness, and the ultimate arrival of the children of Israel on the steppes of Moab within sight of the promised land. It is evident to those of you who have been following the reading of the Torah in recent weeks that the style, the literary style of the book of Numbers differs radically from what we have been reading in previous weeks. The word Bamidbar means in the wilderness, and this is true from a literary point of view. It is a dry book. It is a book of statistics. Large sections of the reading this morning was simply a dryastus account of names, something like reading a telephone directory in Hebrew, with music, but nevertheless still a telephone directory, a list of names. This book comes from an author or authors described by modern Bible scholarship as P, which I sometimes choose to think stands for Pikayun, but in actual fact refers to priest, or the priestly group. As you know, one of the outstanding hypotheses for the origin of the Torah as Pentateuch is that it consists of several different strands or documents. One of the dominant strands is the priestly strand, from which large sections of the book of Numbers, especially the section we read from this morning, comes. Now, the salient characteristics of this author, of this particular strand, segment, or documentary section of the Torah or Pentateuch, his salient characteristics are, firstly, his obvious obsession with statistical detail. You meet people like that. They're always quoting statistics. And then the next day you read in the paper that there are some new statistics which correct those statistics, and you never know where you stand. Was it Disraeli who said there are three kinds of lies? Small lies, big lies, and statistics. The book of Numbers is written by a man or an author or authors who were obsessed with statistical details, families, genealogies, relationships, who was whose uncle and who was whose mother-in-law and who was whose grandson, and who belonged to whom and who didn't belong to who had children, who didn't have children. The style of this author is prolix and diffuse. If he can say something in 15 verses as opposed to one verse, he'll say it in 15 verses as opposed to one verse. He is preoccupied with the minutiae of ritual legislation, and his approach is totally unhistorical. Maybe we should say it is anti-historical. The first opening Sidra of Bamidbar is entirely the work of this ancient author or group of authors, and it consists primarily of two elements. Firstly, we have a census of the people, with that excessive preoccupation with genealogical detail and purity of pedigree, obsession with kosher blood, characteristic of P, a delicate theological blend of Burke's peerage in the social register. Secondly, we have a description of the marching order of the tribes of the children of Israel from station to station in the wilderness. And if you followed the reading in the Sonsino Chumash this morning, you may have seen a beautiful little diagram, geometrical diagram in perfect precision. And this description gives us to believe that 12 tribes, consisting of some 600,000 people, formed a huge square in the wilderness with the ark in the very center of the square, and proceeded in an elaborate scheme of marching mechanically after the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, with a kind of exactness and precision usually associated in New York City with the Rockettes. Our own reading today exemplifies these characteristics of the author known as P. Our rabbis of old were known to be men of great tact and diplomacy, and many of the rituals and customs which they instituted are said to have been instituted in order to take care of the sensitivities and the feelings of others. One example comes readily to mind. At the Seder service, the rubric in the traditional Haggadah says that when the wine is lifted, the matzah must be covered. And one of the reasons given is that since it is Pesach, and since matzah is the center of attraction, matzah is the main guest of honor, as it were, it is a kind of a chutzpah for the matzah to be put into the side and the cup of wine raised to a central position. And therefore, in order not to embarrass the matzah is covered while kiddush is said over the wine, and then the matzah is uncovered. One hopes that the ancient rabbis showed as much delicacy and tact for human matzahs as they showed to the matzah of the Seder service. But the idea, at least, even as a sentiment or as a homily, is beautiful. Now, our rabbis of old seem to have slipped up somewhat this week in their choice of haftarah, which I hope you followed, because it is a very startling, alarming, and remarkable haftarah. You have to read it in the English if you don't know the Hebrew, otherwise you don't get the full flavor. Now, we are presented by the conjunction of Bamidbar with Hosea, or the prophet Hosea, and especially the chapter from which we read this morning from the book of Hosea, with a ridiculous paradox, an explosive paradox, an insensitive paradox. I am not merely referring to the fact that the open verse of the Haftarah is a flagrant contradiction in a sense of all that the Sidra of Bamidbar stands for. The Sidra of Bamidbar describes the counting of the Jewish people, the counting of the children of Israel. And the opening verse of the Haftarah reads, "And the number of the children of Israel shall be such as they will not be countable, and they will not be able to be numbered." It's a kind of a conjunction which one would not have expected from the rabbis. Next to the author of our Sidra, a rigid, dogmatic, hyper-methodical, hyper-systematic, statistical, unromantic, precise, and inflexible priest. The rabbis placed in the Haftarah the untidiest, the most emotional, erratic, eccentric, unsystematic, capricious, the most mentally unstable prophet in the whole of the Bible. And we had a few of those in the Bible. A few words about Hosea, prophesied in the 8th pre-Christian century in the northern kingdom, the first of the 12 minor prophets. Hosea, whose text is often corrupt, which probably isn't his fault, but it's typical, in whose short staccato oracles there is no marked sequence of thought. who is generally regarded as one of the most difficult authors of the Bible to interpret in detail, such a writer, such a prophet, juxtaposed with the geometrical precision of an author whose smallest omissions can be filled in with almost complete certainty, so predictable is he in his global theories. We could have no man more radically disparate from P than H. Hosea married a prostitute. He probably would not have been admitted for T to the circles which wrote P. They were probably very respectable members of some theological seminary. He married a woman called Gomer bat Divlayim, which means literally Gomer, the daughter of 2 cakes of figs. And I regret to inform you that the latter part of her name was probably her price. She gave him 3 children, which probably caused them terrible psychological traumas. He deliberately chose long names to indicate in those names certain messages of God's attitudes towards Israel. Some Jewish parents do the same thing, slightly differently, in the 20th century. Gomer, however, is unfaithful. She leaves her husband for a paramour. But her husband still loves her and sees in his love for his wayward wife the love of God for wayward Israel. I can't give you up, Gomer. In spite of everything, I still love you. On the human level, becomes on the divine level, Eich etencha Ephraim, amagencha Yisrael. How shall I give thee up, O Ephraim? How shall I surrender thee, O Israel? It is probable that Gomer went astray through the licensed sexuality of the festival of some Canaanite sanctuary against whom the prophet Hosea, in company with the other prophets, rails. And that when she left her husband, it was to become a professional temple prostitute. In primitive religion, especially in the Canaanite fertility worship, sex was entrenched as part of a ritual, which I think is one of the best rationalizations that I have ever heard for profligate immorality. And Hosea was one of the first to make a profoundly ethical application of the figure of the sexual relationship between husband and wife to the relationship between man and God. Remarkable, because we are often told that the Bible countenanced polygamy. This is true, but the ideal was monogamy. The story of creation, where God puts one man and one woman in the Garden of Eden, speaks of the ideal of monogamy. The 31st chapter of the book of Proverbs, a woman of worth who can find, speaks of the ideal of monogamy. And above all, the prophet Hosea of the 8th pre-Christian century speaks of the ideal of monogamy. It would have been impossible for any prophet to have dared to express the relationship between God and Israel in a metaphor reflecting the relationship of man and woman if monogamy had not been the ideal. Hosea is concerned with the moral aspect of sex, its sublimation in human experience, so that human love becomes capable of reflecting the love of God and preparing man to understand and respond to such love. This idea was initiated by Hosea, and it was part of a long tradition in Jewish history, which ultimately led to the transformation of a collection of love lyrics known as Shir HaShirim, or the Song of Songs, into a dialogue between God and Israel. Hosea, who knew the depths of human degradation, and from them rested an understanding of God's forgiveness, is the prophet who is chosen to provide a haftarah for the Sabbath before the Day of Atonement. Shabbat Shuvah is the closing chapter of the prophet of Hosea. Could there be any sharper contrast between the respectable children possessed of perfect pedigree and untarnished genealogy of the systematic census of Bamidbar and the author P, and the weirdly named offspring of the temple prostitute of our Haftarah? Could there be any sharper contrast between the formality and propriety of our Sidra, the orderly, geometrically precise camp of Israel on the move, and the unpredictable, sordid seaminess of the menage of the Haftarah. Could there be any sharper contrast between the refined and disciplined religious feeling of the priestly author and the wild, untamed, primitive depths whence Hosea draws up spiritual insight and moral reinforcement? Now, I wanted to tell a joke at this point, but I've forgotten it. It ends with, you're right and he's right and you're both right. You probably heard the joke. I think it's about somebody who comes to a rabbi. A husband and wife are quarreling. They come to the rabbi, and the husband tells his side of the story, and the rabbi says, you're right. And then the wife comes in and gives the exactly opposite thing, and he said, you're right. And they both meet him in the street, and they say, but you gave us the entirely different points of view. He says, you're both right. You know, the funny thing is, when I first heard that story, I thought it was a joke, but having been involved a little in marriage counseling over the years, it's right. They are both right. Because what happens is that somebody not well. Could we get a doctor, please, quickly? Is there a doctor in the synagogue today? Do we have a doctor here today?